So some of the biggest wiring mistakes that DIYers have no clue that they're even making come down to your terminal connections. So in this video, I'm going to show you some of the most common and biggest mistakes that DIYers are making when making these connections. And then I'm going to go over some proper ways of installing them and some better practices so that we have good connections that last for years to come. So let's go ahead and jump right in. Let's get into one of the most common mistakes, and that is using the wrong size terminal connection for the wire that you're connecting it to. So a lot of people don't realize that these terminal connectors actually are made for different and specific sizes of wire, different gauges of wire. They'll take their wiring, they'll insert that into the connector, and they'll crimp down on the terminal connector. They'll look at their connection and think that that is good. What oftentimes can happen is over time, or maybe even fairly soon, depending on the exact circumstances, that wire can come out of that terminal connector. So how can one tell what size wires can go in which connectors? Well, most of the time, if you take your connector and you flip it to the underside, the vast majority of the time, you're gonna see some numbers on the other side. Where you see it says 12 to 10, that is telling you that this particular connector is capable of accepting wires of gauges 12 through 10 gauge wire. Same thing with all these other connectors, including this blue spade connector. This will show that it's for gauges 16 all the way up to 14 gauge wire. The colors on the insulation of a lot of these terminal connectors is of significance. Typically, they're going to signify exactly which size of wire can go in that connector without having to flip it over if you know which colors correspond with which sizes. And you might be asking, well, if I can just flip it over and I can look at what wire size, why does it matter what color they are? Our insulated butt splices, there isn't anywhere that tells you what wire size they are as far as numbers. They just come in different colors. And then of course, like all the other splices, we've got a blue butt splice and we've also got red. And so again, we know which wire sizes can go in each based on the color that they come in. All right, so for this next mistake, I've got some 14 gauge wire. I've got my blue ring connector here. This is the proper size. So I need to strip the insulation off of my wiring first. They will insert the wire into the connector. They don't want to push it up too far because obviously then that is covering the hole somewhat, so that's not right. So they pull it back to where it's not covering the hole anymore, and then they will go and they will crimp it down. Well, do you see the issue here? Yeah, we've got some exposed wire down here below the insulation that anything could just brush up against it and cause some serious issues. So obviously too much insulation was stripped off for this connector in order for the insulation to be able to protect the exposed wiring. On the flip side of that, the other mistake that's made when stripping the insulation off is stripping it too short. So we go and insert it into our connector, and a lot of times people will look at this and go, oh, that looks good. I don't have any exposed copper down here. It felt like it seated up into the connector. The problem is when you don't strip enough insulation off, there's not enough of it making contact with the metal that gets crimped down onto the wire. And if there's not enough metal on it, it's going to create more resistance because you don't have as much surface contact. And you also have the possibility of it having less friction in there. Therefore, the possibility, especially if you don't have a very good crimp on it, of the wire eventually coming out. A good rule of thumb that I use is, do you see how this connector here, it's pretty straight right here, and then it bevels and flares out right down here? You see that ring going around? Well, a lot of times what I'll do, and it's worked for me very well in the past, is I'll take my wiring, I'll just put it up against the terminal connector, and I'll put that wiring up to where I want the tops of the wires to come out of the top, and make my line on the wire right where that starts to flare out or where it starts to bell out. Then I'll take my wire strippers, strip the insulation off, twist the top of it. If you don't twist it, you run the chance of one of these strands being pushed down and therefore not inside of the connector. Then once I've got all those strands twisted together, I'll just insert the wiring into the connector. And you can see some of the copper coming out of the top here. Once we make our crimp, as you can see, we got a really nice crimp on that. Now with this being up here, not only is this creating more surface contact, but there's even less likelihood of this wire being able to come out. And so this is exactly how you want your connections to look. You don't want your wire to be just at the top of the insulation. Not that it's going to cause a huge problem or anything. It's just not a very good practice, and it's really not the proper way of installing this. You do definitely want that little bit of extra wiring coming out of the top here, but obviously you don't want it going too far. And so this connection is not only going to provide a good connection, but it's also going to last for a very long time. Now for this next mistake, this is one that I've actually seen quite a bit. That's where they'll take their wire, they'll take their connector, they'll insert the wiring into the connector, but then they'll take their crimping tool, crimp down on that connector. They'll even give it a tug to make sure that the wire won't just come out, which it won't, and they will think that they have made a good connection. So while they did get some of the metal crimped down, and that's why the wire won't just pull out, they didn't crimp it down high enough. And if we flip it up here to the top side, you can see the top of this where you can see that metal going around the wiring, it's still pretty circular. It should be flattened down. So they just barely catch the lower portion of the metal that's underneath of this insulation, and it crimped down a little bit. But what obviously can end up happening, and oftentimes, at least over time does eventually, is if we just give it a little bit more force than just barely pulling on it to make sure it won't pull out, if we just pull on it a little bit harder, it doesn't take a whole lot to then just pull it right out of that connector. So then how do we rectify this issue? Well, obviously we aim a little bit higher up on this insulation to where we're catching more of the metal. So we'll reinsert this into our crimpers. I'll put my crimpers just barely below the bottom portion of that insulation. I'll crimp it down. And as you can see, our flat spot, instead of it being back here where the original crimp is, it's up here now. There is no pulling that wire out of that connection. And if we flip this over here to the top side, you can see that that metal that's going around that wiring, it is fully compressed down onto the wiring. So we know that we've got a good firm hold. The metal is fully compressed down onto that wiring, holding it into place. And we're gonna have a very good connection here, again, for many years to come. This next mistake is one that I don't think hardly any DIYers are going to know much about. It's gonna come down to whatever crimping tool you use. A lot of times, these are being used incorrectly. All right, so my crimpers are up here on this particular tool. This one's made by Klein, where we actually have two different places where the connectors can go in order to be crimped. Now, a lot of times on some of these tools, you're only gonna see this one up here where you see this little tooth sticking up and then it goes into this crevice on the other side like so. Here on the bottom portion of my lineman pliers, you can see that. This is for crimping wires as well, but we only have that one place where we can do that. Well, what people will oftentimes do is, of course, they'll take their wire, they'll put it up into their connector, and I'm using a non-insulated connector just to illustrate this better. They'll insert their connector into that crimper, and then they'll crimp down on it, then they'll give it a tug, and they'll call it good. There is a possibility that this will last, whereas when we flip it up here to the top, as you can see, one side of the metal on this connector got compressed down, and you can see this other side over here on the left that's still sticking up. That should be pushed down as well. But if I pull on this enough, this connector will eventually release. And I've worked on it a little bit, and since this is up, see how this stranded wire has now released from the other strands? So it allows for the strands to basically be released, and once a strand gets released, then this wiring is that much thinner and that much more likely to then fully release because it's got more room to move. So if I just pull on this a little bit more, eventually it's going to come out. And the same thing goes for the insulated connectors as well. So I'll give you another example of this and how this should be done. So let's go ahead and reinsert the wiring into the connector like so. Then when we go to use our crimpers, where this tooth is, instead of it being on the top, and what I mean by the top is up here on the top part of this, if we flip this over to the other side, the tooth was pushing down on this section right here, where the blade is down here at the bottom, and it only pushed down on one of those sides. So instead of putting the tooth on that, we're gonna flip these over and insert the top of the connector to where it's making contact with this top part where the tooth goes into. Top of the connector is making contact with the top part where the tooth is not. The tooth is going into the middle of the bottom of the connector. And so now we'll crimp down on it. And now, as you can see, both sides of this connector got sandwiched down. The bottom part got sandwiched up and is compressing those wires the way that it should be. And so therefore we have a good connection that again is going to last for a very, very long time. And it all came down to using a very common tool, which a lot of people don't fully understand because they almost never come with instructions. Now, one thing that is nice about these particular crimpers is, like I said, we have two separate holes here, and those are for two different types of connectors. If we look closely up here at the top where the tooth is, the area where we just used to crimp down on those connectors, you will see where it says non. If we look down here and we look at this gap or hole here, where we can also put connectors, if we look over to the right, it's etched in and says INS. So what that is down here at the bottom, this is designed for insulated connectors. And then this one up here that says NON, we used properly in that we used a non-insulated connector. And there are a couple of reasons why there are two separate places for our connections. But the reason why you don't want to use insulated connectors on this are, number one, when this gets crimped down on, that tooth that's in there, when it crimps down onto the insulation on this connector, it's going to want to cut into that insulation. And therefore this jacket on here can become compromised, leading to the jacket possibly being stretched out or cut in places to where it's easier for it to just fall off and fall down onto the wire, or just exposing more of the metal connector that we want to keep insulated. I believe one of the other reasons is if we were to put the insulated up into this one right up here, I think it's more likely for people to not realize that they're not getting a good crimp on these insulated connectors, because since it's covered up, unless you flip it up here to the top side and look down on it, you would never know that only one of these sides got pushed down onto the wiring. Now, for the most part, I don't typically use these crimpers in order to crimp down on my terminal connections. There's actually a tool out there that, in my opinion, is just way, way better and takes a lot of the guesswork and mistakes that are oftentimes made completely out of the scenario. And that's by using these right here. These are also made by Klein, but these are called ratcheting crimpers. And the way that these work are, they're currently in the lock position, but if I squeeze down on it, these jaws will open up. And if you look closely, these jaws have different teeth on the bottom and top, depending on how you're looking at it, in order to make a good connection on any connector. And you can pretty much avoid almost all the mistakes that I showed in this video. And if you don't know exactly what size you're dealing with, if you look down here at the bottom row of teeth, you'll see a red dot, a blue line, and a yellow line. And those are corresponding with the different colors of insulation that are on these connectors. As you can see, I'm using a connector with the blue insulation on it. So I'm going to want to put it in this middle tooth here where we can see that blue mark. So I'll just put it up in there. I'll start ratcheting down onto the connector, and we're going to keep ratcheting down onto this connector and see what our end result is. And if we take a look there at the top, look how compressed down that metal is. Not only do we have a crimp up here towards the top, which is exactly what we want, which is what's pulling all that metal down onto that wire, it also makes a second crimp down here towards the bottom, and so it's also focusing in on the bottom part of that metal that's underneath of this insulation. So if you're going to be doing jobs that require crimping, in my opinion, you're not going to find a better tool out there than this one right here. It's going to make everything a whole lot easier on you, and as long as you insert the connector into the jaws properly, it's going to provide a perfect crimp every time. So like always, I'll have a link for this and links for everything that you saw in this video, along with the other crimpers and all of the terminal connectors that you saw in this video. I'll have links for all of them down in the description down below. When you click on the link of the product that you want to take a look at, it will take you directly to it so you can check them out for yourself. Now, something just to note is these are just some of the most common issues. There are others out there. So if you'd like to learn more about some of those other big mistakes that a lot of DIYers don't realize that they're making, I've done some videos in the past where I go over those and also show some better techniques and better practices like we did in this video. If those are of interest to you, I'll post a couple of videos right over here. You can pick which one you want to click on, and when you click on it, it will take you directly to that video. So I hope that you found value in this video, and if you did, if you could do me a huge favor, hit that thumbs up button right down below. And of course, if you have any questions or comments still, you can leave those down in the comment section. And I'll catch you all in the next one. See ya.